Okay, so I thought since there's so much going on around all of these topics today that I will talk about legislating equality, but really all of the things I've done really since the first book are very much tied together. And so I'm going to start at a really pivotal year. 1999, I was just finishing up my dissertation, but it was a crucial time in Europe because that's when Jörg Haider's party, the Austrian Freedom Party, made it into the, it actually came in second in the Austrian parliament elections, and also that led to the European Union, the other countries saying we need to do something about this issue of populism and anti-immigrant sentiment. And waiting in the wings was this anti-discrimination directive that had been put together by activists over the previous 10 years that was trying to address issues of discrimination in Europe against ethnic and racial minorities. And so that next year, in record time for the EU, a directive was passed, the EU's Racial Equality Directive. At the time, I was actually, as I said, finishing up the dissertation, but also starting to do the research that would lead to the book, Voting Radical Right in Western Europe. And what was interesting to me is when I initially started the research as a grad student at UCLA in the more mid-90s, was that it was really hard to get a handle on the race issue in Europe. And so basically the way I decided to approach it was to look at the immigration issue and then ultimately anti-immigrant parties, because there hadn't been a lot written at the time about far-right parties. Hans-Georg Betz was one of the first to write one of the seminal books on the radical right. And my approach was to say, let's look at the broader context of the radical right and how other parties are dealing with them. But all of a sudden, this racial equality directive passes, and I'm like, whoa, wait a second. Where did this come from? When you had countries like France who were adamantly opposed to even using the word race. Germany had a lot of sensitivities around race issues, and yet they got this directive passed. And so I think what's important to understand, I really approach this as a way to understand the history of how did we get from, this kind of sensitivities around race to passing a racial equality directive. But then what's interesting for the current day is what happened once that directive had to be passed. So it was passed at the EU level, but then it had to be passed into national law. And that's, to me, where we start to see the backlash that we're still experiencing kind of against these, some people are saying is political correctness or, reverse racism, whatever you want to call it. And so to me, the backlash really began in the late 90s, early 2000s, where there was a lot of things happening that were more, positive around issues of discrimination and immigrant rights and so on. And it's interesting at the time, there was a lot of writing going on around immigrant rights, and some of you may know about the writings that were done about how citizenship was maybe no longer needed because there was ideas of transnational citizenship and that immigrants were getting the same rights as citizens in some countries. Well, we've seen a backlash there too, and in fact some countries have made their citizenship policies even more strict. So I think what's interesting is I think 1999 is a real turning point in terms of you see the beginning of far-right parties becoming more mainstream. We've seen the transition of the Le Pens from being more on the fringes to now Marine Le Pen is being considered a front runner in the next French presidential election. We've seen, and from my perspective, what we saw is a shift, from the late 90s of, you had a whole set of fairly moderate leaders, like, going from Bill Clinton, Gerhard Schröder in Germany, Tony Blair, who were, pushing progressive policies, but also policies that might be considered more moderate or even centrist, or even leaning towards the right, rather. And so there was this tendency, the left was kind of moving more towards the center, and the right was being pushed more to the right by the far-right parties, especially on issues around immigration. So in any case, the book Legislating Equality, I go back to the 1980s, when it's at a time when what triggered the initial push for Anti-Discrimination Party was what I talk about in this book, which is the success of far-right parties starting in the mid-1980s. And so in the mid-1980s, you have the Front National in France, actually they came in second in a local election, and that triggered concerns about the rise of the far right in France. You had the National Front in the UK, you had the Republikaner, and the NPD's been around for a while in Germany. But the other things that were happening, a lot of violence against refugees, which we're seeing again, attacks on Jewish cemeteries, things like that. And so the 80s was a time period when you had a lot of left-leaning politicians, particularly in the European Parliament, and led by one in particular who I've gotten to know, Glenn Ford, who had been a civil rights champion in the UK. He went into the European Parliament and actually pushed to create the first committee of inquiry in the European Parliament that looked at issues of racism and xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment and the rise of populist parties. And so this first commission was an important one in, first of all, creating a forum for the European Parliament to actually start saying some things about these issues, but also to, basically influencing the agenda. There was a second commission that was the Ford Commission. The first one, I don't forget, there's a Greek guy who led the first commission, and I should remember it, but I'll forget his name at the moment. The second one was the Ford Commission, because he made sure he was the rapporteur, because the report is always named after the rapporteur. But that one was also, so they actually came up with policy recommendations. But when the Ford report came out in the early 90s, there was also movement by NGOs around Europe to form. They actually initially thought, let's create a coalition of groups that are working on immigration and race issues and try to come up with some strategies. Well, it didn't work very well to have all these different organizations working together. So a few of the leaders got together and said, let's just form one small, agile organization that can really try to address these issues. And they called themselves a starting line group. And they tried to, well, they didn't try, they eventually succeeded. The first thing they did was create a draft EU directive called the Starting Line. And that was revolved around anti-discrimination policies and addressed a whole series of areas of discrimination in the workplace and religion and nationality and so on. With the idea that they would give this to the European Commission and Parliament and hopefully get something passed. And it went through many iterations over the years, and if you're interested in all the details, it's all in here. But the interesting thing was that you had several tracks going on. So you had the kind of a track going with the European Parliament where they were moving things forward. Eventually, the European Council itself had a commission that also looked at these issues, and then you have the starting line groups, so where there's all these things moving towards getting something going, and then the European Parliament, all these different Parliament, Commission, etc. The Commission actually worked with the starting line group at one point to develop a report that talked about these issues and had some concrete policy recommendations, which ultimately led to the creation of a draft directive that, as I said, was waiting and ready to go in 1999 when the leaders of Europe said, oh my God, we've got a far-right guy in Austria, we have to show that Europe isn't racist, what can we do? Well, here you have on a platter this directive. And so, as I said, the directive passed in record speed. So I'm not gonna. I don't want to spend too much. Actually, I gotta keep track of the time here because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk. But so I want to spend the rest of the time talking more about what happened after the passage of the Racial Equality Directive, because it was. I mean, I just having lived through it, and was at the time I was conducting research and talking to people, and most recently I didn't make it to the Brussels Forum this year, but I was there just a year and a half ago, and I was meeting. I mean, through this process, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the other work I've done, I've become engaged with some of the organizations that have been, pushing for this work. And actually, after the passage of the Racial Equality Directive, each country was required to create an equality body, and it was sort of modeled on the U.S. EEOC, but that was the the UK modeled their Commission for Racial Equality, which has become the Equality Commission, Equality and Human Rights Commission. They modeled themselves after our EEOC. It didn't have all the same powers, but and then the rest of the EU countries. Well, when they created the directive, they modeled it based on what the UK was doing in terms of their equality body. But none of them ever got as big or had the same influence as the EHRC, which at one point had over 500 employees and was very active. Unfortunately, as I'll talk about, in the midst of kind of the both economic and political backlash, their budget was cut dramatically, and and also the mandates were diluted by bringing in a whole other set of issues that went. The Commission for Racial Equality was very straightforward in what it was doing. When they became the Equality and Human Rights Commission, there was a mandate to develop human rights commissions in countries based on some UN treaties and so on, but it really diluted their ability, because you're talking about the same amount of people working on a much wider range of issues. So in any case, it took a long time for most of the countries to pass. Actually, I've got a nice little chart in here that talks about how long it took countries to pass the laws. And if you're interested, one of the things I do in here is try to track the discourses around race, and that's why we looked at all these reports. So we did a discourse analysis that tracks, over time, how did the discourses change, and you can see it's a interesting transition from talking more about xenophobia to talking about more about discrimination. So we go from more of a focus on immigrants and xenophobia to more of a focus on race and discrimination over time. But in any case, I focus on Britain, France, and Germany in terms of the transposition, but I also have an article that goes more into detail on we actually go into it here too. But the one I'm going to focus on here, my chapter is called Retrenchment, chapter 7, because there was a lot of growth and success initially. So France, really grabbed on to this, despite the fact that they had, Jacques Chirac was prime minister at the time. He was more conservative, but he just grabbed onto this issue and said, actually, to the point where I was giving a talk in France to a group of professors. I can't remember which university I was at, but I wasn't at Sciences Po, I was talking about how France had to transpose the directive and all this stuff, and I thought, wait a second, we thought this equality law was a gift from Chirac, and I'm just like, no, he was required to do this. They had no idea that the EU had required them to do this. So, I mean, that was another interesting thing. If you're interested in kind of the democratic deficit in the EU, this is the kind of stuff where, even educated people don't know that there's been this directive coming down. But in any case, that was very interesting. But it took they were supposed to transpose the Equality Directive into national law by 2003, and most countries hadn't done it by then. I mean, even the UK was having some issues, and so several countries were getting sanctions from the Commission because they hadn't transposed it. And it did take a while and in countries like Germany, there was a lot of resistance from legal scholars, because Germany, if you know, their legal system is very much individual rights oriented. For example, the whole issue of housing was a big deal, because in Germany, the legal scholars felt that any owner had a right to determine who was going to live in their rental property. You know, it's crazy to think that we should have some law that says they can't discriminate. So there were legal scholars who came out and said, no, this is incompatible with German law, and they were, shouted down. But still, it was a very difficult time to get this passed in Germany. And then one of the things I did is I went around and actually visited some of the equality bodies. So the one in Germany, it was like hidden. I mean, it's literally, to find your way there, you had to go into this building and, work your way around. And, here was one of the biggest EU countries. They had 20 employees, and only half of whom were lawyers. And part of the issue in Germany too is that it was really being pulled into the immigrant integration debates, which I can talk about too, because just in terms of the bureaucracy, there was a state secretary for immigrant integration, and then you had the Interior Ministry, which had some responsibility for immigrants and integration, and then you had the equality body over here, and they all were trying to wrestle control of who was the. I mean, I would go and talk to the state secretary and say, oh, we're responsible for integration, and I go to talk to the Interior Ministry, no, we're responsible for integration. And then you have the equality body, which is trying to focus on discrimination and has very little resource. I mean, one of the things we looked at was the budgets, and so by the time you get to the mid 2000s, especially 2007, 2008, when the financial crisis hits, well, here's a great excuse to cut the budgets of these equality bodies. So, like I said, even in the case of the UK, their budget was cut in half, and they cut their staff in half. Ireland was in particular. Actually, there's the guy who ran the equality body in Ireland wrote a whole book about it. How he was getting into political trouble because they were going after employers, and the government didn't like it. And the same thing happened in France. When I went to France's equality body, they were in this really nice building, at the time when they were still in favor. I was like, wow, it's very impressive. They had a lot of outreach. They had this one line you could call if you felt you were being discriminated against. One thing to keep in mind, I don't want to forget to mention, is that in Europe in general, and this has been an issue with the Volkswagen case, is there are no class action lawsuits. So it's very difficult for people to get together and try to, go after an employer or something like that. But in France, despite that fact, they were having some success in going after employers and calling them out on discrimination issues. So when Sarkozy became prime minister, he didn't like that, and so he actually made the very successful head of their equality body resign. And he put in one of his cronies, who happened to be a Afro-French woman, but who basically did his bidding and decided to shift the focus from race to gender equality issues and maternity. I mean, not that those aren't important issues, but basically they dropped a lot of the issues that they've been dealing with. And so like I said, in the early 2000s, when the things were just getting going, there was a lot of optimism around dealing with these issues, and there was a lot of successes. And then what happened in Europe more generally is you saw this shift from more left-leaning governments to more right-leaning governments. So one of my arguments is, the reason that the Racial Equality Directive could pass in the first place is because you had all these, the left-leaning governments were dominating the European Council. And then you get into the early 2000s when they're supposed to be transposing it, and you see, France, they went from a more moderate conservative government under Chirac to Nicolas Sarkozy, who was fighting, trying to get the votes of the far right voters. And then you had, in Germany, Gerhard Schröder to Angela Merkel, and the UK, Tony Blair, who wasn't particularly friendly to this stuff anyway, left government, and I mean, it wasn't necessary. There's not a direct correlation necessarily with the governmental shifts, but it definitely had somewhat of an impact, particularly at the European level in terms of support for these kinds of efforts. And then you also, I mean, I have this other book I worked on called Immigration Policy and Security, which looks at both the U.S. and Europe on these issues. And you have 9/11, which not only had an impact in the U.S., but also in shifting attitudes around immigration more generally in Europe, and the pulling in the security element. And so, and we're still seeing the repercussions of that. I mean, obviously we follow the terror attacks and so on. So, so it wasn't just that you have the shift in the government. You have the shift in. I mean, I wish I had continued with my discourses analysis, because you see this shift in the discourses to a more security type of approach, and that and even now you're seeing with the issue around the refugees as being a security issue, and unfortunately we've had the terror attacks which are playing into that. So it's not like this is just a red herring. It's really, there are issues, but as we know, a lot of this has been homegrown. It's not that you have people coming in necessarily. It's people who've lived there all their lives, or people who've been there since they were kids and become radicalized, and so on. And in any case, we could have a long discussion about that, because we have our own homegrown who have lived here forever and are doing terror attacks. But in any case, so just the point being that we didn't get to this point with Marine Le Pen, looking very successful in France, and what we're seeing here in the U.S. with Donald Trump and others. This hasn't happened overnight. For those of us who've been following these issues, this has been a very an ongoing trend towards more populist approaches, towards even though we had this law pass in Europe, undermining of the type of work that was actually being successful at dealing with discrimination issues, and the securitization. And one of the things I focused on after 2008 with the election of Obama is all my friends in Europe are like, oh, will there ever be a European Obama? And it's not looking that way right now. But one of the things we thought we should take a look at is this whole issue of race and representation in Europe, because of course minority and ethnic populations are growing. They're starting to look at, actually one of the initiatives that the German Marshall Fund has been pursuing is promoting, and along with the U.S. Embassy, particularly in Paris, is promoting and supporting young leaders and trying to get them more engaged in politics. So actually one of the reasons I was going to the Brussels Forum was to be involved in the young leader training groups that they were having, the Transatlantic diversity leaders and fellows. And so for a good, I'm trying to think how long this is, at least for the last 12 years, the U.S. Embassy in Paris has been reaching out to Muslim communities and actually having fellowships where the young leaders come to the U.S. and travel around. So we've hosted, and they've been doing a lot of this through the German Marshall Fund, because they have their fellowship program for young leaders as well. And so there have been a lot of, actually it's I think the French government resents it at times, but there's been a lot of support here in the U.S. for these young leaders. And so in the last few years, they've really tried to make it a transatlantic group, so that the young leaders from Europe can learn from the young leaders in the U.S. and vice versa, so that they're learning from each other. So even though there's been this retrenchment on the policy front, there has been a lot of activity trying to get immigrants and ethnic minorities in Europe more engaged in politics. And so, because of course, as we know, that's what's influencing things here, is that you have, California is a classic example of what can happen when you get large ethnic minority groups more engaged in politics. When Prop 187 passed, that really galvanized the Hispanic population here in California and really shifted the electoral map here. There's some expectation that we're going to see something similar happen potentially at the national level because we've seen the spread of the Latino populations across the U.S. And so there's a lot of interest in Europe right now. I think what we're seeing, and here's where I'm going to go off on more of a speculative tangent, is we're seeing the rise of populism because it's a reaction to things changing. The reality, and what I tell people is, yes, things are changing. It is not in the imagination of particularly white males that we are seeing change. If you look at even somebody like Nicolas Sarkozy, when he formed his cabinet in France, it's been a while, but still, he had many ethnic minorities and women in his cabinet. Obviously more so for the current left government, and there is a tangible shift of trying to get more women and ethnic minorities and so on into leadership positions and so on. I can, as being the first African American woman provost at a place like Menlo College, you can look at that and say, oh, this is great, we've got an African American woman in this position. You can also look at it and say, oh, that's another position that a white male is not getting, who consistently has gotten that position in the past. And so, yes, and the other thing I looked at when I was looking at the Radical Right book is that especially in the early 2000s, there's a lot of writing about modernization losers, and I think that was more of an issue in the 90s and early 2000s than it may be now. But that there was I remember there was a cover of The Economist magazine that was talking about how men are the ones losing out in the service economy as we deindustrialize, as technology becomes more important. Even though you can look at Silicon Valley as being predominantly male, still if you look more broadly across the economy, women were doing better than men, and I think they were talking about this at the last recession. Women recovered more quickly than men, and so there is a tangible thing happening out there where, as opportunities open up more for some, more broadly opportunities may be shrinking in manufacturing and so on. And this is true in Europe, just as I think that's a lot of what's driving the support for populist politicians right now, is this tangible sense that we're not doing as well as we were 30 years ago. And so I think we can't, in general, society can't ignore that, and it's really important going forward that we pay attention to, there's a tendency to say, oh, it's wonderful and diversity is great. I'm not saying that's not true, but we also have to keep in mind that there are people out there who are feeling a tangible sense of loss. And that if we don't, I think it's a mistake for politicians to not pay attention to that and look at raising all boats, and making sure that people understand that policies are raising all boats, that it's not just impacting one group or the other, which is why it's it would have been really nice if Congress would have been willing to pass more of the job measures that President Obama, I thought in 2008 we should have gone for just heavy-duty infrastructure movement. But on the other hand, you do have some of those things happening in Europe, and it's not necessarily, diminishing the support for these populists and far-right politicians. So it's not there's not one answer to any of this. So a very complicated picture that I've been following for many years, and it's what's interesting to me is I'm seeing all these issues that I've been following for so long just kind of coming to a head right now, and at some point I'm going to have to write some more about it. I'll see if I can find time in between being a provost. So, and I think, yes, luckily we have some time for questions and discussions. So I've put some provocative things out there, so I hope you guys have some thoughts about it.